Today I'm going to be talking about poor health and loneliness in later life and looking at the role of cognitive impairment and social resources, and I'm going to draw on data from the CFAS Wales study. I'm going to look, I hope, at some different pathways from poor health to loneliness and test out some theories and look to see whether these theories may be complementary or conflicting theories. And I'm going to test out some of these theories using cross-sectional data from the CFAS Wales study. Unfortunately, our longitudinal data are not ready yet. And I'm going to conclude with some issues for research. I've put in brackets mostly, because this is, as I've just pointed out, cross-sectional data. I think the actual policy and practice implications are perhaps not as strong as the implications for future research. So, I have rewritten what I'm going to say today quite extensively based on a presentation that Christina gave a couple of weeks ago at LSE in London, and this was part of the Campaign to End Loneliness's research showcase. And Christina posed a very interesting question that set me thinking. Anyway, at LSE, Christina posed the question about dementia. Is it a cause or a consequence of loneliness? And she suggested that the research agenda has really started to focus on the negative health consequences of loneliness. And because it's focusing on poor health, that means that loneliness is becoming medicalised. And I think Jenny showed one of the slides just now that looked at the effect of loneliness and social resources on mortality and morbidity compared to different types of health, what we would think of health, unhealthy lifestyles and impacts on health. Of course, one of the consequences of this is we start to think about a cure for loneliness in the way that we might think about a treatment for disease. And Christina said, does this mean we are now denying loneliness as a part of the human experience? So this started me thinking, well, is this what I'm doing? Am I doing research that is, that's all right, that's gone. That is perhaps denying that human experience. So I've started to mull over some of the work I've done and reflecting on it today and seeing if we can spark some debate around these issues, I think. So the most powerful argument I could think of that was raised by Christina last week was there's a potential perhaps to cure some forms of dementia through curing, if we want to use that term, loneliness. And so I want to start with a study that Wilson and colleagues did in 2007 that suggests, and I'll explain why this suggests this may be the case. First of all, though, I would like to explain what I mean. I know I'm talking probably to an audience of gerontologists who are very clued into what the difference between cognitive impairment and normal cognitive function and maybe dementias are. But in case not, I would like to be very clear what I'm referring to, because I will be talking about cognitive function later on as distinct from dementia. There is considered to be a normal ageing of the brain which changes cognitive function. There is a step beyond the normal function of a brain based on age or education that might be considered to be mild cognitive impairment. At this level of impairment, someone may experience difficulties with communicating, difficulties in certain thought patterns, but this level of impairment doesn't interfere with their activities of daily living. Around 5 to 10% of people with mild cognitive impairment per annum will convert, if you like, to a form of dementia. And there are different forms of dementia. There are Alzheimer's disease, there is vascular dementia that may be caused by strokes within the brain, but there are also other types of dementia. So ones may be associated with alcohol abuse or drug use or traumatic brain injury, and we'll see that some may be caused by loneliness. The thing about mild cognitive impairment is that not all of people with mild cognitive impairment will convert to dementia, and there is that potential to remain stable with mild cognitive impairment or reverse mild cognitive impairment. And you also see on the bottom row here that other forms of dementia may also be reversible. One of the things about dementias are, although psychiatrists can look at a range of symptoms and make a judgment on whether they think someone has Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia, it's only after looking at a brain after someone's died you can actually establish if Alzheimer's disease was present. So it's been looking at brain pathology and looking for plaques and tangles in the brain that you will firmly establish whether or not that's Alzheimer's disease. And that's important in terms of what I'm going to describe about Wilson's study. The other thing about dementias as well is that currently there are no drug cures for dementia. At the best, we may be able to slow down the progression of dementia, or we may be able to control symptoms, but there are no currently medical cures for dementia. So going back to Wilson's study, Wilson conducted a longitudinal study in the US. And in this study, he used an amended version of Yenny's short loneliness scale. I say amended in as much as they fiddled with it, but they didn't actually validate this as an amended version of the scale. So we could say this study is flawed. We don't know really if it is measuring loneliness or not. However, despite that, over the course of the study, Wilson and colleagues found that the risk of clinical Alzheimer's disease increased for those with high levels of loneliness at baseline. But it also increased for those with high levels of cumulative loneliness. And by this he means loneliness at high levels over more than one phase of the study. And we might think of this in terms of persistent loneliness, rather than a transient form of loneliness that may only be present at one time and someone then recovers, gets over it, manages to cope with it. Perhaps they get over bereavement and re-engage with friends. But what is particularly interesting about Wilson's study, and which is often neglected, is that he was able to look at the brain pathology of some of those people who experienced what looked like Alzheimer's disease while they were alive and experienced loneliness. And among those people of whom whom died and who they did brain autopsies on, they found that loneliness was not related to Alzheimer's disease pathological findings, nor to cerebral infarction. So in other words, there were no brain tangles in the brains of those people who looked like they had Alzheimer's disease, nor were there signs of vascular dementia. The people had displayed signs of dementia, but they didn't have those diseases associated with it. So he suggested that there may be novel neurobiological mechanisms that might be involved in those in that expression of dementia. Now, I've gone through this long-winded explanation because to me that suggests that as social scientists, if we can tweak around with something around loneliness and actually for some people prevent a form of dementia that is not associated with the disease, then there is room for us to be involved in, I think, in research like that, thinking about some of the predictors of loneliness as well as those outcomes of loneliness, and essentially working on things that may improve the well-being of people in later life. We don't know whether this study holds true in the UK. There isn't any similar work at the moment. As part of the CFAS study that I'll be talking about later, we are asking for participants to donate brains, and hopefully this may be something we'll be able to examine too in the study. But I wanted to think of this in terms of, does this mean, because we're doing this work, and this is a challenge that Christina set us, as social scientists, are we colluding with this biomedical agenda that's been set for us? Are we colluding in medicalising loneliness? And as I was missing the change at Newport, I was thinking, no, I don't think I am actually colluding. I would like to think I'm challenging some of the biomedical models of loneliness and hopefully demonstrating some of the flaws in what are often less than holistic models. They often focus very narrowly on the individual's resources, their health or their psychological well-being. And I'd like to then think about what, as social scientists, can we bring to the debate on the consequences of and the risks for loneliness. So by looking at this, I wanted to start by looking perhaps at a psychological theory. And this is the cognitive reserve theory. And again, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. This theory was built almost on the converse of what Wilson found. So Wilson found people were displaying signs of dementia, yet when he looked at brain pathology, they had no brain pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. Cognitive reserve theory came from the observation that some people whose autopsies were done on their brains had the brain plaques and tangles that were associated with Alzheimer's disease, yet during their life they did not express those symptoms associated with dementia. And so there was a theory built that maybe certain things equip someone better to deal with the neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease. And in particular, maybe these particular activities, such as physical activity, social activity, or mental activity, may mean that some people's brains are better equipped to perhaps circumnavigate brain tangles and work out new neural pathways that mean they don't express dementia in the same way as other people do. Well, what has that to do with loneliness? Well, if we've got social activity in there, maybe in some ways, Jenny's already spoken about, there is a link between your level of social resources and loneliness. Perhaps there's a link there with loneliness and cognitive reserve. But there is quite a danger by taking this very individual view of cognitive reserve, that we expect it to be an individual's responsibility to engage in things like Sudoku. There's very little evidence, by the way, to suggest this actually does have an influence on cognitive reserve. But it doesn't take into account some of those structural barriers that may prevent people from engaging in a high level of physical activity or having a social network, a social convoy that they can protect. Maybe there are things that get in the way of you being able to keep your social convoy with you through your life. And maybe those are some of the things that as social scientists we should be exploring and bringing to the debate around cognitive reserve. I want to then think about a social psychological theory, the cognitive discrepancy theory, which Jenny has already well described this morning. This was developed in the very late 70s and early 80s by Perlman and Peplau. And as she said, in this model, loneliness is a discrepancy between the desired and the achieved levels of social relations. Perlman and Peplau suggested that a mismatch between the expectations about your social relations and your actual social relations could be precipitated by certain events. So that might be bereavement. It might be bereavement of a spouse or bereavement from friends dying. It may be because you've relocated. And Jenny gave the example of someone moving to the beach. So you could, if you relocate, adjust your expectations for friendships as well as having your actual relationships changed. And if those two match, you don't experience loneliness, which she nicely described earlier on. But there may be other reasons why you cannot achieve those expectations about social relations, and they may be around poor health. Poor health that may restrict your ability to maintain and keep those friendships that you've had throughout your convoy. There is another aspect, though, of cognitive discrepancy theory, which seems to be falling out of the discussion. Perlman and Peplau originally said that in the process of evaluating whether or not your social relations meet your expectations, you go through a process of attribution. So who's caused that level of social relationships that you have? Is it your fault, or is it some other reason why you don't have the number of friends you might expect to have? But there is also cognitions, and that's around your personal perceived control over whether you can do something about your achieved levels of social relations, and also social comparison. Who are you comparing your situation with? Is it an unrealistic comparison with your own situation, maybe when you were in your teens and going out clubbing every night? Is that a realistic expectation if you were in your late 80s? How you make those social comparisons is going to influence how you experience loneliness. So this is the pathway that they suggest leads to loneliness. You have some predisposing factors, precipitating events that can affect either your expectations for social relationships or actual social relationships. If those match, you don't experience loneliness. But if there's a mismatch between the two, there's an experience of loneliness. And they suggest that those cognitions and attributions affect those experiences of loneliness. However, in this model to date, environmental influences have been somewhat neglected. And Tom Scharf and I had a look at the TILDA data, the Irish Longitudinal Study of Ageing data, and tried to look at the ways in which environmental contexts may influence both your expectations about social relations, but also how you may achieve your social relations. So, for example, if you're living in a rural area, maybe it becomes more problematic for you in the face of poor health to actually carry on accessing those friends that you want to do. In this particular model I want to test today, I want to see whether cognitive impairment, rather than being an outcome of loneliness, whether cognitive impairment influences that pathway to loneliness at different stages. So I want to see whether cognitive impairment would amplify any difficulty that a person had in poor health, someone in poor health. It would amplify any difficulty they had in maintaining their social relations. So I've already explained that someone in poor health may have difficulty in getting out, may have difficulty driving. All of those things might influence the way in which they maintain their relationships. Does cognitive impairment amplify that? Is that an additional problem? I mentioned just now that cognitions are now rarely addressed in the empirical tests of this theory. In fact, I've heard more recently people actually dropping the cognitive part out of the title and just calling it discrepancy theory. So the attributions part and the cognitions are often left out of how people think about this conceptually in the way we might experience loneliness. But I want to think again about how cognitive impairment may play a role and suggest that if you're cognitively impaired, that may disrupt some of these cognitive processes in terms of your own sense of personal control or the way in which you make social comparisons with others. And in order to do that, I'm going to draw on data from the CFAS Wales study. So I shall describe a little bit about this study. The study started originally in 1993. It was conducted in 6 centres across the UK. 5 of those were located in England and 1 was in Wales, which was in Gwynedd, North Wales. At the time, the study was funded by the Medical Research Council. Samples of older people were drawn from GP registers in each of the 6 centres, and it was stratified. So there were equal numbers of people above and below 75 years of age. We're now 20 years on from this first study, and we are doing our follow-up study. I find this particularly exciting because this was my very first research assistant post working on the MRC CFAS study, and it's really nice to be able to go back to my roots and be looking at those changes over the last 20 years. So the study has been extremely influential. There are a whole range of papers that have emanated from the study which really describe the prevalence of dementia and the cognitive decline in the population of older people in the UK. Most recently, there's 2 waves of data collection have been completed in England, and a publication in, I think it was The Lancet, has cast doubt on some of the estimates of dementia that we've been working with, because it suggests that there is a cohort effect in dementia prevalence. So later born populations have a lower risk of prevalent dementia than those born earlier in the past century. So they're really important findings coming out of this. The CFAS 2 study then was conducted in 5 centres. 3 of these were in England, and that arm of the study was funded by the Medical Research Council. And this time we have 2 study centres in Wales, one in Bangor and Gwynedd in North Wales, which is a predominantly rural area, and one in South Wales in Neath and Port Talbot. Port Talbot is an industrial town that is on the coast in South Wales and is dominated by the steel industry. And Neath is the sort of hinterland of Port Talbot, is a post-industrial area, previously a thriving mining community, many of which, well, all of which actually, the mines are now closed down. So it's an area in decline, quite a stark contrast to the area we're looking at in North Wales. But we wanted to capture a range of experiences in Wales. I'll explain why in a minute. Again, we're drawing a stratified sample of people aged 65 and over from GP registers, and in total there are 10,500 participants across the study, and more than 3,500 of those are located in Wales. We've completed baseline data, which took over 2 years to collect, and we have just got our first data set, which is exciting to work with. We are now into the second wave of data collection, and that will finish in January 2016. And at that point, we will have 2 waves at which we can compare different time points. The CFAS Wales study, because it's funded by the ESRC, its particular aims are quite different than the main CFAS 2 study. And we're particularly interested in assessing what influences the development of cognitive impairment and perhaps what may delay or even prevent it. But the sorts of things we're interested in are environmental and psychosocial factors that may influence cognitive impairment. So we're looking at social networks and social support, and that's a particular interest at the Centre for Innovative Ageing at Swansea. Bangor looking at bilingualism and resilience, and Liverpool University, which are for the sake of this study honorary Welsh, are going to be looking at nutrition. All of us are looking at different forms of activity and education. In terms of Christina's argument about are we colluding with the biomedical agenda, you may look at that and say, this bears some strong similarity to the cognitive reserve theory, and that is true. And perhaps I would agree with Christina on this point, that we would be colluding with a biomedical agenda. That is how the study was framed, and that is how we got 3.2 million to fund the study over the course of 2 years. But that does not mean that we are not looking at some of the other areas as social scientists we think are really important to tease out. So the influence of environment, the influence of cultures, and the way in which expectations may differ between places. So I want to use some of the CFAS Wales data to test out some elements of the cognitive discrepancy theory. I'm going to use as predisposing factors, which I'm going to include in a model as controls, age, marital status, gender and education. And the precipitating event I'm particularly interested in is disability. And I'm using the Townsend Disability Score, which ranges from no impairment to severe impairment, to actually capture the extent that someone experiences disability. Social relations are going to be captured using the Lubbock social network scale. I have no measure for expected social relations, but I'm using Jenny's short loneliness scale as an outcome measure. So the expectation is that any mismatch between actual social relationships and needed social relationships will be attributable to, will be caught in the loneliness scale. And I'm using mediation analysis, and apologies again if everyone's familiar with this. In this respect, I'm looking at the effect of disability on loneliness. And I assume that disability is going to directly influence loneliness. That people who are more disabled are going to be more lonely than those who are less disabled. But I think that this is partially accounted for by the way in which they're impaired in maintaining or developing their social relationships. So in other words, those people who have greater levels of disability may find it more difficult to access the environment and keep up those relationships with their friends. And this in turn, so higher levels of disability will lead to lower levels of social resources. Lower levels of social resources will in turn lead to greater levels of loneliness. So part of that relationship between disability and loneliness will be accounted for by this pathway through social resources. This is the conceptual model for the analysis. On the left-hand side, you can see that disability, as predicted, did predict loneliness. So the greater a level of disability, the greater level of loneliness experienced by someone. On the right-hand side of the model, we see the mediation pathway included there. Disability, higher levels of disability mean lower levels of social resources, and lower levels of social resources are significantly associated with greater levels of loneliness. The coefficient on the C pathway, which is this bit here, this is the direct effect of disability on loneliness. And over here we see the direct effect, although it's still significant, has decreased between the two models, and it's a significant decrease. So that suggests that the mediation pathways has been significant. In other words, part of that effect of disability on loneliness is accounted for by social resources and mediated by social resources. But you may realise there is nothing in this about cognitive function. That's the next step in the model. And here I want to use moderation analysis. Moderation is used when you're interested in explaining whether or not a relationship is amplified or diminished by another variable. And in this case, I'm looking at the pathway between disability and social resources. And I'm expecting that cognitive function will amplify any difficulty that someone with physical disabilities has in maintaining their friendship. So let's think of a concrete example. If you have a physical disability, you may not, it's more severe than other people, that may influence your ability to drive. You may be more reliant on public transport. That, with a disability in itself, is going to be maybe problematic for you. If you have a cognitive impairment too, not only may you be reliant on public transport, you may also have trouble reading a timetable, for example. So you'd expect it to amplify the difficulties that you're experiencing. But I also think it's going to influence the cognition, so how a person feels in control of their experience of loneliness or how they compare themselves to each other. And so in this case, I think it will amplify the relationship between your actual social resources and the experience of loneliness on the other side of the model. So this is the new model, and down here we have a moderating effect on either side of the mediation model. So the red triangle is the original mediation model. We can see that disability is still associated with loneliness directly. There's a direct association. But in this model, disability does not influence social resources. It's no longer statistically significant. However, social resources still are associated with loneliness. So lower resources still mean higher levels of loneliness. Let's have a look at the role of cognitive impairment, which is over here. We see that cognitive impairment have a direct effect on loneliness. Those people who are more cognitively impaired experience more loneliness than those who are not. But cognitive impairment also has a direct effect on social resources. In other words, those who are more cognitively impaired have fewer social resources. And it's this that has essentially knocked out the role of disability. It is more important to the level of impairment you've got in determining your social resources than your level of disability. But we also have an interaction effect where social resources and cognitive impairment influence loneliness. So this was the B path. This is the side of the model where I said I expected cognition to affect one's sense of control and social comparison, and would expect to see an amplified effect, and we see that in this model. So this graph down the far side shows the mean loneliness scale, and at the bottom I've divided the Lubbock social network scale into just two groups, one group that's isolated and one group that's not isolated. So on the left hand side of the model we can see that people who are more isolated also have higher levels of loneliness. And the three different lines represent different groups of cognitive impairment. So the top line, the blue line, are people with mild to severe cognitive impairment. So they experience, in all situations, greater levels of loneliness than anyone else. And it's significantly different from the other groups. So the green line represents those people with moderate cognitive impairment, and the yellow line that you can barely see are those with no cognitive impairment. So although in all cases we see that isolation is related to loneliness, it's different depending on the severity of your cognitive impairment. It's high, you have higher levels of loneliness if you're more cognitively impaired than those with no cognitive impairment. What does this mean for social scientists? Well, I think what I've tried to demonstrate is that it's not maybe as simple as looking at a one-way cause and effect. That although Wilson's model suggests that loneliness may cause dementia, that cognitive impairment, which may precede dementia, may have a role in different ways. So it may influence your ability to maintain your friends. It may be, there may be different ways in which that operates. I mentioned just now that it might be about the environment. Is your environment dementia friendly? We're not talking necessarily about dementia, but does it make it easy for you to go out if you're experiencing cognitive impairment? We may have gone a long way to making buildings maybe accessible for people with disabilities, but are we making places accessible for people with cognitive impairment to continue to maintain those convoys of friends and those relationships that they need in later life to keep them from being lonely? I've also suggested that they may have a role at the individual level on how one thinks about one's own personal control and the way in which one compares oneself with other groups. So in terms of this model I've presented here, which is called the Human Ecological Framework, the Human Ecological Framework suggests there are relationships between each system of the framework. So in other words, individuals can influence their family and friends, but family and friends influence the individuals. Your community, the place in which you live, it involves, it can impact on the individual and vice versa. As social scientists, I think we can bring to the debate on causality and the role of loneliness and certainly cognitive impairment and dementia. We can consider the roles of each of these systems on the individual and the individual on each of these systems. We can also bring to the debate notions of the life course perspective, not only in terms of where those friends are located in one's life course and one's convoy, but also the nature of loneliness itself. Whether or not we focus on transient loneliness or loneliness that people recover from that we may consider to be a normal part of human life, or whether or not we should be focusing on things that appear to be deleterious to our well-being, which may be this persistent and severe types of loneliness. I think also we can bring to the debate that there are various impacts, that there are not just one pathway, that there's not one influence, that systems interact. And in some ways we might see a vicious circle if we don't think of ways perhaps to intervene. So interventions in terms of developing one's convoy might not be what's needed if we think that actually it's because people can't go out and maintain their relationships. We need to work on the community and the environment to ensure that people with cognitive impairment can stay engaged with the people that they want to stay engaged with. And in terms of interventions, I think that's a very different cure than the medical model might be thinking about. So in conclusion, and these are the conclusions about the models that I presented earlier, increasing levels of disability can be considered to be a precipitating event which leads to a decrease in achieved levels of social interaction, and that ultimately impacts on a person's experience of loneliness. Cognitive impairment has a direct impact on social resources, and as I've just explained, does that mean our UK communities actually responding to this age dementia friendly challenge that's been set up by the World Health Organization? Are we achieving it if we still see that people with cognitive impairment are not, well, it's related to lower levels of social resources? And finally, we see that cognitive impairment moderates that association between social resources and loneliness, so it amplifies the influence of social resources on loneliness. I said my implications weren't going to be very policy oriented because it raises more questions, I think, about research and what we need to do and what we need to understand, more than providing us with sort of policy directions at the moment. This is a Welsh sample. It's located in 2 distinct areas in Wales. If this model were to be used as a policy implication, we would need to test it out in other countries and other areas. There also could be a range of other models. This is based on testing that particular theoretical pathway. I've started with a theory, I've tried to apply it, but it is cross-sectional data. We are only seeing associations. I cannot prove causality. I can only suggest that because theoretically it looks reasonable that that may be the picture out there. Moderated mediation. Now, I've started to investigate that. I was talking about the effect of cognitive impairment really on environment. So ideally, I should have been looking at the moderating effect of environment on A pathways and then the moderating effect of cognitive impairment on the moderator. And likewise, on the other side of the model, I should have been looking at something like personal control, moderating that relationship, and then looking at the influence of cognitive impairment on control. Now, we do have the ability to do that, but actually a more complicated, a more robust model could be tested out to really tease out some of these notions that is about environment as well, and expectations, comparisons, and social identity. It's cross-sectional data. I've already pointed out that we need to be able to test it longitudinally to establish causality. And tentatively, we could suggest that we may need to provide more opportunities or support for people with cognitive impairment to maintain or develop social relationships with their family and friends. But I do think if this model does prove to be quite robust, that we probably need to also explore qualitatively some of the work around that influence of cognitive impairment on the sense of control and on social comparison. So how does it play out when someone compares themselves to others in a similar situation? Are they able to? Does it result in unrealistic expectations about the sorts of things that they may be engaging in? I shall leave it there, and I hope I didn't lose too many people with the statistical models. Thank you.